And now we're very happy too that Jamie Fairchild from NIAC is here, and he's going to come and speak to us at this time. Jamie?
Good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick question. Should I give any particular sign to move the slides forward? But I see someone just dropped off a clicker for me, so that's great. It's a pleasure to be here. We would have liked to have had a larger Natural Resources Canada contingent today, but time and work pressures didn't allow for it. So I'm here representing the department to speak to our nuclear liability update. I've met a number of you before in different fora, a lot of new faces for me as well. Just a quick bio, I've been with the department for a couple of years. I'll speak to our staffing update shortly, but there have been a lot of changes. Fortunately, it's been enough time for me to really embrace this portfolio, to understand its nuances, its complexity, its history, and its importance with respect to the nuclear sector more broadly, which continues to build profile within our department, certainly in alignment with the government's narrative on clean energy and the path forward to decarbonization. So with that, I'll move forward. The structure of the presentation, I think I'm going to be here for about 10 minutes or so. Happy to answer questions afterwards. I'll go through the slides, and please reserve your questions for the end. Staff update, changes in the department. A lot of institutional knowledge has left in the last 6 months. And then to speak to the legislation itself. So the NLCA, the final year of liability increases next year, an update on indemnification and tribunal rules. I wanted to speak also to the importance of the consideration for small modular reactors and a lot of the work that we have been feeding into, led mostly by the Nuclear Energy Division, the sister division within the Electricity Resources branch. Finally, the 5-year liability limit review. A quick update there, something enshrined in legislation by virtue of kind of international precedents for that concept. And then I'll move into an international update for you. And so this is actually where, for those of you who've been trying to coordinate on different files with me, we've been spending a lot of our time and effort in the international space in the last year, as Jacques, my predecessor, and Dave, our former director, have kind of migrated off into the sunset of retirement. So, the staff update. Basically, we've had full turnover in our Electricity Resources branch in the last 18 months. So we have a new Director General, Marco Prezzuti. He replaces Niall O'Day. So Niall would have been spearheading the legislative kind of process at a fairly high level when the NLCA was both, working its way through the House for kind of the 4th or 5th time, and also in, I guess, the establishment of the operational procedures. And so Marco's been with us for about 12 months. Many of you also know Dave McCauley. So Dave, his official retirement starts on Monday, the day before we host all of the parties and signatories to the Convention on Supplementary Compensation in Ottawa, which is next week. And it's funny because I sent him this deck. He's still been helping out on the liability file, and I asked him for some comments on this deck, and he provided comment boxes and changes of color and text everywhere else. But I looked at this slide a second time, and originally his comment said, "Sadly, Jim Delaney replaces our beloved Dave McCauley." And so I went back and I said, "I'm sorry, Dave, I don't think it's appropriate to keep that in there." But anyways, he always had a great positive spin on things. He'll be missed, but it's still available to us as needed. And then there's myself. So, I'm replacing Jacques Hainaut. Jacques really was in the weeds on this stuff for a number of years. Between Dave and Jacques, 50 years of nuclear liability, institutional knowledge has left the department. The last 2 years since I joined the department from the Ministry of Northern Development and Mines in Ontario has been great. Just a transitionary period, fairly long for anyone who knows what kind of turnover can happen in a big bureaucracy, just HR processes, et cetera. That can take some time, but we've been really lucky. And also, both Dave and Jacques were excellent at data management. Jacques in particular was like the guru of our online file storage system. So I've been fortunate that I have this multi-decadal reference for me as we move forward, and we have some interesting conversations that have a history, yeah, it should be very useful for all of us as we continue to implement the Nuclear Liability and Compensation Act. So next year is the final year of the transition to $1 billion in coverage for a nuclear power plant. And the transition since the NLCA has come into force, kind of in reference to the historical narrative on the file, is that in order for us to get here, there have been a lot of conversations internally with some of our collaborators here today, as well as in the international space. And so in order to get to this place, really the terminal point and the actual implementation of the NLCA, something I did want to speak to is kind of the breadth of effort and experience and expertise people in this room have provided. There's different opinions on certain aspects of where we've gotten to, and I'm sure there will continue to be. And so I think it's important to thank everyone here to have worked with us, as the federal government, to get to a place where we have a piece of legislation that honors our international treaty commitments and really puts Canada at the forefront of the nuclear liability claims and administration space. And I think there's a lot more work to do. There's changes that are constantly happening, both in the international markets. I'll speak to, revised Paris at the end of the presentation. But I think it's important for us, really, and I think the big reason I'm here was just to see people, introduce myself, shake hands, give you an update on what we're doing, but try to build a kind of a new foundation as my predecessors have left. And so I'll kind of speak now to the federal government's role and the departmental role in fulfilling the ultimate vision of the NLCA. And so I think the people in this room have done an excellent job of working towards the operationalization of the legislation. One of the things I've learned in the last 2 years is that internationally, there's a full suite, I call it a full menu of nuclear liability conventions. But I think we are held in high esteem internationally for how far we've gotten with respect to where the rubber hits the road. I think the nuclear liability space is very much a preventative legal pillar in the international law space. Obviously something none of us in this room hope to ever have to use. But as a part of the ultimate vision of the NLCA, there are some elements that require further work on our part. So the first is the indemnification heads of damage. You folks have worked towards a world-class claims administration process. We saw some of the work that NIAC has been doing on behalf of the operators and insurers to create, I guess, a modern claims management system, something that would really resonate with people across the political spectrum. And so we now can kind of leverage that moving forward and try to build on that so that we cover all of the other aspects of the regulations that require attention. And that includes the Nuclear Claims Tribunal. So again, this is worst case scenario stuff, but the NLCA provides for the minister, in the interest of the public, to establish a claims system through a tribunal. And so trying to bridge the gap between the great work that has been done, the process that exists, and what could hypothetically be managed or overseen by a federal tribunal is something that we want to work towards in the next, I won't overcommit us, but in the coming months and really years. Like, it's a big process. There's a lot of work to do. It's taken years for you folks to get to where we're at, but it's a really good stepping stone for us, as a federal department to get to where I think ultimately we want to get to. So the SMR roadmap. So another piece of the kind of domestic perspective evolution of the nuclear space is the small modular reactor piece. And so something that we've been participating in over the last year was the Regulatory Readiness Working Group. So myself and Jacques Hinault were contributing to those conversations. Could I get a show of hands? Do people know what the SMR roadmap is? Could you put your hands up? Okay, so I wish it was everyone. I mean, I think there's a strong sense that it is the future of nuclear, domestically, globally, or certainly a big part of it. And there was a great multi-agency disciplinary group that was established with operators, industry, government. We were a non-voting member of the table for the SMR roadmap group. It was led by the Nuclear Energy Division, so our sister division within the Electricity Resources branch. And so at the end of the day, the determination that was made within that group was that our liability framework is sound, it's robust, it's progressive, it assigns liability limits based on commensurate risk. We work with the CNSC very closely in our establishment of liability limits, and moving forward, certainly we've had some conversations with them, in particular with respect to the first license application at Chalk River Laboratories for an SMR facility. And so while we're pretty comfortable with the ability of the existing regulatory framework to embrace SMR technology, there may be some tweaks required. And just in passing, one of those is that while Chalk River Laboratories and the ACL are an existing operator within our legislation, it's possible this first SMR is a consortium of interests, entities, corporate entities, and so they would be a new operator we would be adding to the NLCA. And actually, just another update on that, we removed our first installation last year from the list, the schedule, and the nuclear liability and compensation regulations, and that was also a lesson for us. We had not done that before. They only came into force in 2017. The next calendar year, we were removing our first installation. There's an expectation, I think, one or two others in the next 12 months will disappear. And so we now have a bit of experience there that we can lean on to, expeditiously manage the legislative process within government. So I'll move next to the 5-year liability limit review. So I think many of you know that Dave McCauley, the former director, has been pretty, tuned into the international narrative, history framework on nuclear liability. And so the 5-year liability limit review, I can say, having reviewed the international conventions quite a bit lately for our hosting of the first CSC meeting next week, is in alignment with that. So there's an expectation that there are a lot of variables, it's a complex space, and so international treaties, by and large, set liability limit review as a key trigger, often for the countries, the signatories, the parties to meet, for the Paris Convention, the Vienna Conventions, and the CSC even considers the liability amendment as like a key trigger. And so we integrated that into our national legislation. The minister is required by virtue of Section 26 to review the liability limit at least once every 5 years. And so, subsection 2 lists the criteria. And so the first one is, I think, fairly obvious. It's kind of an economic consideration, right? The consumer price index, 5 years at 1.5 to 2.5% inflation. There's a bit of an influence on a $1 billion liability limit there. Our international commitments. Ultimately, this entire regime is derivative of that. We have the Nuclear Liability Act in advance of our ratification of the CSC, but we also are committed, should there be any changes in the international space, new precedents that are set, to consider them. And then also anything else that we want to consider. We've got new technologies being introduced to the market. There may be other social pressures. All to say, we've actually, despite only needing to review the legislation in 2022, started our review of the liability limit. Now, this doesn't mean that the liability limit is going to change. An assessment done in the early 2000s that fed into the establishment of the original limit, made us quite comfortable with where we ended up on the $1 billion, at least for power plants. But we are undertaking studies right now. We're having conversations. It's entirely possible we'll be engaging with you more actively in the coming years, well in advance of that 2022 requirement, so that we can, make recommendations within the department on where we think that liability limit should be. I think a number of you sit at international tables and are aware of some of the work, both academic and institutional, that's going on. We've got, hopefully revised Paris coming on board in the next 12 to 18 months, which will elevate, the demands, and I'll speak to that formally in a slide or two, but the demands for capacity within the insurance industry. But there may be other pressures that speak to our recommendations. And I think on this and a number of other fronts, it's important for me to convey today that we're happy to have a conversation. We've got a new group of staff managing this portfolio and a number of others. But I think we're quite seasoned in this space or other spaces that transfer well to the nuclear liability piece. And yeah, we're always happy to have a good, data-driven, but open-minded discussion. So, the international update, the CSC meeting. So, there's 7 or 8 kind of specific conventions out there, depending on if you bridge them together or not. Our discussions with our American colleagues over the last 12 months at the highest level between our Minister and Secretary Perry led us to offer to host the inaugural meeting of the parties and signatories to the Convention on Supplementary Compensation for Nuclear Damage, CSC for short. It's a pretty lengthy title. And so this meeting is actually going to be taking place in Ottawa next week. So we've got between 10 and 12 of the signatories that will be participating. We've got the IAEA in attendance. General Counsel for the Nuclear Energy Agency will also be in attendance. And so the vision for this meeting, we had 3 primary objectives. One is to try to bring the countries together for the first time to have a conversation about the CSC in particular and the operationalization of the treaty and nuclear liability regimes more broadly. The second was to discuss how we can work towards, as countries, as signatory and party countries, building the CSC into what it was originally envisioned to be, which is a global nuclear liability convention, a global regime. And for those of you who don't understand how significant that is, the IAEA action plan post-Fukushima made a strong recommendation that a global liability regime be implemented. And the CSC is, by virtue of the way it was drafted, very inclusive. So you can be a party to a previous convention, but you can also join as an annex state, as we did, because we had not signed on to any other conventions prior. And so that's the second. And the third is, the third objective of the meeting is to try to build some routine. We've called it the inaugural meeting. It's aspirational. It could be also viewed as the first meeting. But we hope that the meeting that we host next week in Ottawa will lead to further discussions, the establishment of a couple of working groups. And that's one of the things in our assessment of the global nuclear liability landscape. You have the INLEX group at the IAEA, you have the the law committee at the NEA, and you have a couple of other, I'll say not institutional, but private sector initiatives, INLA, the International Nuclear Law Association, and there's a whole lot of groups. There's people talking about nuclear liability at a very high level, but to kind of bring it back to where we are today, we've done a good job of operationalizing it. I'd say we're at the forefront of that, and if you want to build social license, but you also want to provide business certainty so that you can grow your economy, you can create opportunities for nuclear, you need to have a system that will work and is ready to flip the switch. And so we'll be talking about that, and we have talked about that at international meetings, certainly since I've been here. And so the last update is with respect to the ratification of the amended Paris Convention. And so, a lot of you are in the space, you understand, I'm sure had conversations with clients internationally about the additional demands this will place on the system in Europe. Because of the commitments, the way things were drafted, ultimately Italy is kind of the holder, or I don't want to say the friction point, in the ratification of Paris. I think Turkey has not ratified either, but because they're not a signatory to the Brussels Convention, I think really it's about those parties that are signatory to both Brussels and Paris that led to the Italian government being kind of the opportunity to move forward the ratification of Paris. And so some countries have implemented an increase in liability limits domestically in advance of that, in preparation of that. But if this happens, it's going to create pressures internationally for increased capacity. It's also going to, I think, increase expectations and kind of set a new bar for where liability limits will be. And I think that was pretty much it. I actually know that was it. But I'd be happy to take any questions that you have now. And yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.